And in case you're wondering, yes, it works with third-party VSTs as well. Fender's new Motion controllers have been on a lot of people's radar since they were first shown earlier this year at NAMM, and today I finally have both of them here in the studio. I've actually been playing around with these for the past couple of days, and I want to be clear, this is not a review. In my opinion, a proper review can only come after you've spent some meaningful time using the product, so instead, consider this video more of a launch day overview and my first impressions as a longtime Studio Pro user. Now, if you do end up picking one up, I am putting together dedicated courses for both controllers to help you get up and running as quickly as possible. They're currently available for pre-order at a discounted price, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them later in the video. Before we dive into the actual controllers themselves, if you are unaware, these units are the successors to the Atom and Atom SQ MIDI and dock controllers, which were released back in 2018 and 2020 respectively by PreSonus. They officially launched today, and they retail for $269.99 for the 16 and $329.99 for the 32. Inside the box, you will find the controller, some documentation, and this time around, we finally get a USB-C cable, which is really nice to see. Now, the very first thing that I noticed after taking these units out of the box is that they immediately felt way more premium than their predecessors. They are both larger than their previous models, and they weigh a bit more, which overall contributes to a heftier feel. I'll make sure to include full specs for both here on the screen so you can compare. As far as the pads and buttons go, they feel really good. I was actually talking to the product manager for these units back at NAMM, and he told me that for these controllers, they partnered with Fender, the Italian supplier behind many of our favorite keybeds, to develop a more premium pad. Without doing any measurements, the pads on the Motion 16 look about the same size as the pads on the Atom, but the pads on the Motion 32 are definitely bigger than on the Atom SQ, which to me has just made playing the Motion 32 a lot more enjoyable. The one thing I will say though is that initially I was a little concerned about the pads on the Motion 16. Even though it looks like there are 16 individual pads, it actually seems like they're all part of one big larger piece underneath, because at least on my unit, the whole thing shifted back and forth a bit if I pushed the pads from side to side. The Motion 32 didn't have this issue, so at least with the 16, I was worried that this might lead to accidental triggers, especially because the pads on both of these units are way more responsive than on the older ones. On the Atom and Atom SQ, I had to apply a fair amount of pressure to get the pads to trigger, but on these new units, I barely have to touch them to get any sound. I'll have to wait and see how I feel about these pads in the long run, but so far I've really been loving them, and I've had no accidental triggers, even on the 16. Now, the pads are not the only thing that got upgraded. The knobs also got a huge step up. On the Atom, I really enjoyed how they gave me a good amount of resistance, but I didn't like that they had no texture. On the SQ, it was a complete opposite. The knobs had ridges that facilitated the grip, but at least on my unit, I felt a lot less resistance. Well, on these new units, Fender seems to have landed on a nice balance, because both the 16 and the 32 both now have ridges for easier grip, but also a fair amount of resistance as well. My only reservation here is that as I was initially playing with the knobs, I noticed that they felt a little loose compared to the previous models. I haven't had any issues yet though, and I sincerely don't think that this will be a problem, but I'll make sure to keep an eye out for that. One interesting thing that I did notice though was that when I first got these units, they were running firmware 1.05, and they felt at that moment like they had a slight haptic feedback to them. After updating to 1.06 from Fender's recommendation, that feeling disappeared. Maybe I was imagining it, I honestly can't say for sure, but if haptic feedback is possible, I would love for Fender to bring that back or to introduce it in a future update. We'll talk more about this later on, but the other thing you should know is that these knobs are now dynamic, meaning that the function they perform will change depending on what screen or mode you are on. Speaking of screens, this is yet another area of improvement. The Motion 32 has a much bigger screen compared to the SQ, which honestly is a very welcomed addition. The SQ, and now the 32, have always had just a little bit more functionality and integration to Studio Pro compared to the Atom or the 16, and so the bigger screen absolutely helps not only to navigate the feature set, but also to better control things like the new mix mode. The Motion 16 also got a screen this time, and although it is significantly smaller, it still works quite well. The last thing I'll say here before we move on is that both units also have a 3.5mm MIDI in and out ports, if that is something that is useful to you. Now, as far as setup goes, these are pretty much like the old units, and it could not be easier. Because both of these are first-party controllers, if you are using Studio Pro, all you have to do is connect them with the included USB-C cable, and Studio Pro detects them automatically. That's it. If you are using another DAW, my guess is that you'll just have to manually add them as an external MIDI controller, but I'm sure most of you know how to do that already. Okay, so let's talk about layout. So starting off with the 16 here, I want you to notice first that we have one big encoder here on the right, and this is mainly going to be used for navigation purposes. I'm sure there's going to be more instances within the DAW where this becomes also useful, but so far I've noticed that it really just controls a lot of the menus here on the screens. At the very top on this unit, you're going to find 8 more encoders that again are dynamic, so they are going to change depending on what mode you're on, and we'll talk about that in a second. But then on the far left, you'll also notice that this unit has one more knob that the 32 doesn't, and this is a dedicated volume knob. Now this works very, very similar to something like a fader port, because essentially whatever track I click on, it is then going to assign the volume fader to this knob, and then I can change the volume very, very quickly. So I'm changing Serum there. If I go over to sample 1, I can now change the volume on that. And as a matter of fact, when I do that, you can see my fader here on the fader port also move up and down. And so if you ever wanted something like this on the fader port, you now have a dedicated knob to do that for you on this unit. Now, if you come back over to the right-hand side here, of course, we have that little screen that I was talking about. And then below that, and we'll go into this a little bit deeper in a second, but you also have the mode section. So you have different modes here, including control, chord, scale, add. Now for the add mode button, this is what you use to add plugins and VSTs directly from the controller. And if you do have this unit, then they also gave you a dedicated replace and load button for that. Below that, we have the control buttons. Again, another crucial part to these controllers, but here you're able to control the song, which is basically the arrange view, plugins, edit, which is the note editor, and then the mixer. Below that, we have your basic navigation buttons that we got on the older units, a shift button, which is going to be used to trigger the secondary effects on the pads. And then below that, you're going to have your transport controls, of course, but also a dedicated undo button, a loop button, which just basically turns it on and off, a dedicated retrospective recording button. I can't tell you how happy I am about this, because I actually mentioned this in a previous video. It is such a useful feature, but it's kind of hidden, and it's not too hard to get to because you just have to open up the inspector window. But if you're brand new, you might miss it. And so I'm so glad that we got a dedicated button for that. Of course, a click track button to enable this on and off. And finally, if you take a look here at the bottom, we have a dedicated tap button for the metronome. And so basically this does exactly like it suggests. If you tap, it'll just change the BPM on Studio Pro. Super cool. Now, of course, here in the center, you're going to have your 4x4 grid of 16 pads. And as I mentioned, they feel absolutely incredible. If I shift over to impact here, they feel really, really good. And as I was mentioning before, they are very, very sensitive. So I am barely touching them. And as a matter of fact, even if I press on the sides, super, super sensitive. Now, as I was saying before, if you do press shift, you do get to access a lot of the secondary functions on these pads. And let me tell you, they have expanded quite a bit. Like before, you have like your copy and paste, duplicate, quantize, but now they also gave you a couple other options like grid changing options. So I can change the grid if you take a look here, simply by pressing shift and then using these pads. Fantastic. On the left, we have your modulation touch slider. We have your octave up and down, solo and mute button, your preset buttons in case you are in a native plugin. You can use these to basically go back and forth between the presets. A 16 pad button, which basically just spreads out one sound across 16 velocities. And the last two things that I want to show you here is that we also now have dedicated buttons here for the clip launcher. So if you do use that, I'm happy to announce that you can now just do it all from here. Really awesome. Now, lastly, at the bottom here, you're going to have your pad banks, which on this unit also double up as your note repeat function. To operate that, you would just simply hit the repeat button and then press your sound and change the value. Now, interestingly enough, the 32 does not have this dedicated repeat function, and I did ask Oscar, the product manager, and basically what he told me was that this unit, just because it resembles a drum pad, a beat pad, it's a little bit more geared towards beat makers, of course, but at the end of the day, this is really just a hardware remote control for the note repeat function here in Studio Pro. And so if you wanted to, and I'll do videos on this, but you can still create some sort of like user map on the 32 if you wanted to get that, but also kind of have this feature. Okay, swapping over to the 32 here, obviously we're going to have a lot of the same buttons, but because of the layout change, they are going to be positioned a little differently. If you take a look at the right here, we are going to have that big encoder knob that we talked about. Our preset buttons are now beside it, so they're a little differently. Below that, we have our navigation buttons, the shift button, the transport controls with the tap and click button right next to it. To the left, we're going to have that big screen. And if I'm being honest, I really love this because it actually tells you what these encoders do depending on where you are. And the best part is that they're touch sensitive. So if I click on something, it'll light up blue, verifying that that's what they control. Now, the one feature that the 32 has that the 16 doesn't is that if you take a look on the top and bottom of the screen, we actually have these little buttons. The SQ also had something similar, but they're essentially user assignable buttons that you can program to do whatever you want. I mean, I'm talking like commands from Studio Pro or even macros. So if you're a macro guy and lover like me, then these are going to be really useful. The way you get to these is you simply press shift and control, and then, you know, you got some here, and you can kind of use the big knob to shift between them. And then of course you can always just use these or change them if you want to. Now below this, we're going to have the mode section, just like on the other unit, solo, mute, the control focus area, the pad banks, the pad button, the 16 button, the fixed velocity button, and then the launch button, which again will just simply pull up the launcher. This unit also has a dedicated pitch touch strip, which the other unit did not, so very cool. And then of course, last but not least, at the very bottom, you have your octave up and down and these sort of rectangular pads. And here, of course, we also have 32 instead of 16. One last thing worth mentioning is that if you are using another DAW, Fender also included a DAW mode feature that lets you select a different DAW provided that it's supported. I haven't had a chance to test it yet, but my guess is that it simply maps all of the controls to your DAW of choice. I'm not sure if they plan to add support for more DAWs in the future, but right now, if you go to settings, DAW mode, you do have the option to go over to Logic, Ableton, FL, and Cubase. There's so many exciting new features on these new controllers, but as you can probably tell, there's a lot going on here. So if you do end up picking one of these up and you want a little guidance getting started, as mentioned, I am putting together dedicated courses for both controllers. These courses are designed to explain the essentials, show you how everything fits together, and help you get comfortable with your new controller as quickly as possible. They're currently available for pre-order at a discounted price and officially launch at the end of August, so I'll have a link for you down in the description if you are interested. One of my favorite things about not only these new units, but the old ones as well, is that they're not just MIDI controllers, but also DAW controllers. Of course, you can use them to make music, but you can, if you choose to, also use them to operate all of Studio Pro without having to reach for your mouse or keyboard as much. The old controllers did a lot, but as you can see, these take things to a whole new level. So let me show you a little bit more about what that looks like. Now, we're not going to go over everything here, but I do want to point your attention to the mode section, the control focus section, and then the encoders at the top, because they really are the ones that give these controllers a lot of functionality. Starting with the control mode here, this is going to basically allow you to control Studio Pro. Once you're here, if you also go to the control focus mode and you hit song, you're basically controlling the arrange view, the screen that you see here in front of me. And as mentioned before, the encoders here will sort of change to adapt. And so the first one will change the playhead position, the zoom, the loop. That's really awesome. Now from here, you can press the edit button to bring up the note editor. And again, these knobs at the top will adapt to note editor functions. So here we have transport control, zooming in, note select, note start position, note length, and so on and so forth. If you press the plugin button, it'll just bring up whatever VST you currently have, and obviously you can make your changes there. And then last but not least, you can also press the mix button to bring up your console. Now, whenever you do go into the mix control focus mode, your encoders here at the top will now turn into dedicated faders for whatever you got going on, and they even match in color. You can see it happens to both. The special thing about the 32 though is that you also get those reflected here on the screen, so you can see exactly what you're changing and by how much. So that's something a little special that the 32 has that the 16 doesn't. Now that's the control mode, but you could also use both units to go into add mode, and this will basically let you add any first party plugin or virtual instrument. Now whenever you click on that, it'll give you a few options, so you can either do an instrument, an effect, an audio track, or a note effect. And so for example, if I did want to bring in, say, an electric bass, I can navigate to that. On the 32, you can either press the encoder here, hit the load button at the top, and on the 16, you can also just hit the load button, which is a dedicated one. But if we hit load, brings that up instantly. As mentioned, you could also add effects. So if you want to add a delay, we can do that very, very easily. And if you go back to plugin mode, then you can control all of these parameters with the automatically assigned functions here on the knobs. Super, super cool. Now that's all well and good, and that's all very cool, but my favorite features from these new controllers are the new scale and chord modes. Let me know if you want dedicated videos on this new feature, but just to give you a little taste, let me show you what it can do. So if you click on scale mode here, you can obviously pick whatever scale you want. So let's do major. Let's go over to the key and select it. So I can do, say, for example, an E flat major. And now these pads become part of the scale. And I could very easily change on the fly. And of course, on the 16, it works very, very similarly. So you can click scale, go over to, let's say, major. Let's do minor on this one. So we're gonna do natural minor. Let's go down to the key and let's do an E flat. So E flat minor. Now the other thing too is that on both units, you can choose to either have your scale laid out sequentially like this, or you can go into guide mode, which will basically spread them out similar to a keyboard. And it works the exact same way here on the 16. So you got guide or lock. And so for example, if you struggle with coming up with melodies, then bro, this could be it for you. Just click scale, choose whatever you need, and there's no way for you to play wrong notes now. Now that's pretty standard for most controllers, and I'm glad we finally got them here on these new units, but I think the standout feature is the chord mode. If you're anything like me, sometimes you struggle to come up with chord progressions, or worse yet, if you don't really know how to play the piano, like how do you come up with something good? Well, they seem to have solved this for us, because if you do click chord mode, you're gonna get two options. And we'll start here with the what they call famous chord progressions. You can cycle between them. So on the first one here, it's a 1, 5, 6, 4, very popular. And so the way this works is that they are grouped in groups of 4. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4. And each of these pads are going to represent one chord and its different inversions. And so what I mean by that is, take a look. If I press this first one, right? Whatever key you happen to be in, it's gonna be the first chord. The first pad of the second group is gonna be the second chord, so the 5, then the 6, and then the 4, okay? But you could also switch it up and get different inversions. Instead of playing this one, you could play this. So on and so forth. And the cool thing too is that this controller is smart enough to know what you already have pressed. And so if you do, for example, this, and then you want to add a couple extra notes, it just adds the extra note, not the whole thing over again. Now, as mentioned, this is the famous chord mode, and they have quite a bit for you to choose from, but they also got the simple mode for the people who want to try this out on their own. And so if you go here, for example, and I click on triad, I can as well choose minor, choose my key. Let's do E flat minor. And then now these all become chords that pertain to that key. So check this out. First chord, of the E flat minor scale. Second chord of the E flat minor scale. Isn't that crazy? And so if you didn't want to get locked into some of the famous chord progressions here, you could try your own thing. You could try like a 1, 5, 3, 6, whatever. But here's the best part, I'm about to blow your mind. A lot of times when you have features like this, and this happens in Scalar a lot too, if you use Scalar, you know, but when you play this or you try to record this, you don't get the full chord. You only get that one note, which is fine if you're gonna convert it to audio, but if you want that MIDI information to then stack other VSTs or whatever, you really want all of the notes that that one chord is made up of. Check this out. And in case you're wondering, yes, it works with third-party VSTs as well. This is such an incredible feature for people who may not have that music theory knowledge, and it's so inspiring to have this at your fingertips. Now listen, I'm trying really hard not to jump to conclusions because again, this is a first impressions video, but so far I am really impressed with what Fender has given us here. So huge shout out to the entire team. I am super pumped on using these on my everyday workflow. Over the next few weeks, I'll be putting both controllers through their paces, so make sure you're subscribed because we've got plenty more Motion content on the way. Don't forget to pre-order your copy of the courses for these units if you're gonna pick them up. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.